In Corinth, we've said, but let me remind you, in Corinth, they thought that they were the best church in the world. Wise and strong and glorious and rich. They thought they were the most gifted, the most spiritual. You went to Corinth for the best worship, the best leaders, and the best preaching. So look down at verse 13, page 1158. Paul says, stand firm, be courageous, be strong. And they say, yes, Paul, that is us. Except Paul does not think that is them. We started this series in 1 Corinthians so long ago at All Souls that I bet no one can remember chapter 1, but we need to remember chapter 1. Paul's first chapter, it began with some names and a problem. Names like Paul and Apollos and Stephanas, names that come back here in his last chapter. See, they were strong. They were so strong. Did you see what he had to say in verse 10 and verse 11? Paul has to say, verse 10, verse 11, about the young colleague that he's planning to send to them, has to say, please don't scare him. Please don't treat him with contempt. See, for them, being the best, being strong, that meant that church was a place of competition and division. And I just think that is very normal, isn't it? Everywhere we go. Strength is for getting what you want, isn't it? Normally. It's about being strong enough to push the other guy into second place. But look down, verse 13, verse 14. The kind of strength that Paul wants is in verse 14, where he says, do everything in love. Those two verses, they go together. Verse 13, verse 14. Can you be strong enough to love? That is our main theme for this evening. It's repeated throughout the chapter, the idea of love. Verse 14, we've just read. Verse 22, it is love for Jesus. Verse 24, it is Paul's love for them. And then the whole chapter is just worked out examples of love. So look at verse 13 again. Let's have a bit more detail on verse 13. Be on your guard. That is a kind of soldier word. Guard duty, never sleeping, focused, trustworthy, alert. And that's right, because the next phrase assumes that they are under attack. Stand firm in the faith. Somebody is trying to push them away from the Christian faith. Then be courageous, that is literally, in the original, that is be a man. And it has the same sort of uneasy double meaning that it has today. So it means stop being a child and be an adult. But it also means be a first century man rather than a first century woman. It's addressed here to men and women in the church. In fact, it's used a lot in the Greek Old Testament. It means something like fight bravely and then be strong. The Corinthians, they are terrified of weakness. The picture we've got all through this letter, they are desperately, desperately insecure. And so they've inflated themselves into the best church in the world in order to make themselves feel better. When the truth is, and this would be, write this down for your notes if you want to, chapter 1, verse 26, 126 says, actually, not many of you were wise. Not many of you were influential. In fact, God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. When he picked out the people to be part of his church, you were chosen for your weakness. And the only strength that means anything in church is if you are strong enough to love. And that really, that has been the whole letter. Chapter 13 is the pinnacle, where he says that, spiritual gifts, giftedness without love, that is nothing. Nothing at all. They were selfish in church. And he wants them, please, can you be stronger than that? Which means love. 13 verse 4, love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. Do you remember our slogan back in those chapters? It was come to church for the sake of other people. And the examples we've had, it's been give up your rights, chapters 8 to 10. It's been don't use your gifts, chapters 12 to 14. Do whatever you need to if giving up yourself can help other Christians, the people that Christ died for. But in Corinth, they're too competitive, too proud, and too insecure to live like that. And that is why we've had 4 weeks on chapter 15. That's why chapter 15 is so long and so heavy, if you like, because Paul is trying to deal with their insecurity so that you can stand firm, verse 58, so that we can put other people first and take all of the costs that go with that. And we've said it's because our bodies will be raised. That's why we can do that. So do everything in love. So verse 16 is just full of practical examples of what a life will look like if you've really taken on board chapter 15 and the resurrection. This isn't just a random personal request at the end of the letter. So let me try and show you. We won't have time for all of it, but you can ask questions later. I want to show you a few different ways that this would take us. If we would live radically all for Jesus, if we would sacrifice our bodies here in this life, if we'd give up on pride, if we would do everything in love. So first of all, the value of God's people. That's verses 1 to 4. Point 1, the value of God's people. Verses 1 to 4, turn back to verses 1 to 4 of chapter 16. They are all about money. They're about a single practical thing. It's about a collection of money taken from the Gentile churches to give to Jewish Christians living in poverty in Jerusalem. That's the idea. And I suspect this was both too easy and too hard for Corinth. That's why he has to really lay it out for them. I think on the too easy, I think, they'd say, give us something, courageous or strong to do. Just, putting aside a few coins every week. That doesn't seem very spiritual. Doesn't seem very exciting. Give me something world-shaking to do. But also too hard. Because in Corinth, they really worry about their status in the city. And actually, when they come to church, they're there to show off how rich they are. So what would they say? They might say, do you really expect me to give some of my hard-earned money? But if I do that, I will have less money. That's how it works. And don't be too hard on them at that point. Back in chapter 1, their goal here was evangelism. Their goal was to attract their city to Jesus. That's why they wanted to be wise and strong and rich and powerful. They thought Corinth will not give Jesus a chance unless they can see some people who kind of would really matter, could really cut it in Corinth. Some people like them, or dressed like them, or rich like them. If you like, this is sort of Gucci for God, or Chanel for Christ, that kind of thing. Whereas if I give my money away, well, then I will be a Primark Christian, not a Gucci Christian. And what good will that do then? Well, Paul says only if you love them. Verse 1, it's a collection, and it is for the Lord's people. It's a gift, verse 3, because you have money and they don't. And you won't do that. It just all depends on how you see them, the value of them. Because you see, companies don't give money to their competitors. Or football clubs, they do not give money to their rival teams. That is throwing away your edge, your advantage. Why would you give money to Christians in poverty in Jerusalem? Would only be if you didn't think they were the competing church, the ones who maybe could be the best church in the world if you aren't. You would only do it if you love them. We spoke last week about the way that I think most of us, many of us, some of us, we live at 80%. As in, I know I'm supposed to give, but at the same time, I also want to sort of more or less keep up with my contemporaries who are not Christians. So, maybe I know, okay, not the same size house as them, but 80% the same. Or maybe the same size house, but 20% further away from the tube. And I suggested last week, that is why we're so miserable. Because love does not envy, does not boast, is not proud. See, 80%, it is close enough to always feel like I'm missing out. My house is nearly as nice as that, but not sacrificial enough to feel like I'm living all for Jesus with the excitement and the joy of that. So chapter 15 has said you have a second body, a better body waiting for you. So this is the spare life. So, of course, your body here and now, it needs clothes to wear and it needs a roof over its head. But the treasures of the new creation, they are beyond comparison, better than Gucci and Chanel. And the body you will have to enjoy them is more than you can appreciate. So you are not a fool to give up what you cannot keep now to gain what you cannot lose. And then the rest of verses 1 to 4 is simply about how to make love practical when it comes to money. It's simply recognizing that all of us find this difficult. All of us have a sort of money blind spot. The goal is there at the end of verse 2. The goal is so that when I come, no collections will need to be made. He's saying all of us, left to ourselves, we all have wallets with holes in. The money just seems to dribble out week by week. So here's the recommendation. He says, why not once a week? Do this regularly. Don't do this when you have some extra cash. Don't do this all in one go. Don't do this in the future when your ship comes in. Do it regularly. It says each one of you. Someone said to me during this series, someone said giving, that is what older people do. I wonder, do we think that? If so, why do we think that? I wonder, is it, so older people normally tend to be better paid than younger people. So is it that we think that bigger donations are more valuable than small ones? Maybe we think that. Jesus disagrees. Jesus says the widow's mite was actually more than all the bags full of money that the wealthy people put in. Or maybe, again, I'm just guessing, tell me the question time, maybe, is it that older people have had their fun? So eat and drink for tomorrow we die. Or, worse, tomorrow we turn 40, whatever it is. Or is it that older people have the stuff already, the stuff that society tells us that we need if we're going to be a human being? As in, I'll start giving when I've paid off the student loan and I've got my house deposit together and I've paid off the mortgage and I've qualified in my trades. Paul says, each one of you, a sum of money set aside each week in keeping with your income. Giving it does not start when you get old. Giving it starts when you become a Christian. And it starts, if you like, it starts next Sunday. Do it every week, he says. Do it in keeping with your income. Might be more for some and less for others. Maybe next Sunday it will be a £1 coin for you. But that will be a start as you regularly give. And I don't think, actually, he has in mind the church collection plate at all. I think, in fact, he wants to avoid collections here. He says, do this at home. And all you need, the technology you need a cup or a bag, something like that. And you just, every Sunday, you put in it some money until it is time to send it off to Jerusalem. And also, verse 3, verse 4, when we do that, we will do it with care. There's no sense here you have to blindly trust anybody to do the right thing with your money. Verse 3, you choose your people, I'll write the letters, and we will deliver every penny to where it's needed. Okay, so that's the principle of valuing God's people with your money. And obviously, today we're free to use modern technology. You can ask your bank and they'll do this for you every week by week, or you can tell your company, they'll send it from your payslip directly to those in need or to Christian causes. But what matters is to be strong enough to love, even with your bank balance, and to start with something next Sunday. Okay, second, the value of God's work, verses 5 to 18. 1 to 4, that was all about money. That was quite easy to see, I think. 5 to 18 is broader, but there's quite a lot of money in 5 to 18 as well. Love actually often is connected to what we give up, what we transfer. Money is just how we transfer stuff from us to other people. So verse 5, verse 6, that's about Paul's next visit to them. He wants it to be good. He wants a decent amount of time with them. Verse 7, which we'll come back to at the end. But then look at the so that in verse 6. It says, so that you can help me on my journey. That's translating a word that means something like send me forwards. And if you have good memories, you'll remember we met that word about a year and a half ago when we looked at 2 John and at 3 John. And here's the distinction we tried to draw out. So we read this, send me on my way, help me on my journey. And we think, oh, that must be like when my friend comes to visit from Kenya. And instead, he wants them to think, no, that is like when one of our All Souls mission partners is visiting from Kenya or wherever else. So let me draw out the difference. If my friend comes to visit, my friend sleeps on my sofa bed for 2 nights, and then I help them with their journey by showing them where the Elizabeth Line tube station is, and you can, just go there and you get to Heathrow. And maybe if I'm feeling generous, I give them a book to read on the flight. And I say, good visit, nice to see you next time. But I think our mission partners would be a little bit disappointed if that was what our support for them worked out as. So actually, this is like your own room to stay in for the months that you're here for while you're in England. And then here is all of the money you need to get back to Kenya or wherever else. And actually, here's all the money you need to support yourself for 2 years while you serve Jesus there. Help me on my journey. It's the same thing in verse 11. Timothy, he's going to come to them and he'll preach his way through this letter with all of the tellings off and the problems and the conflicts that will mean. And then at the end of all that, it's your job to send him back to Ephesus. Fund him for his next year of work in Ephesus, where there is, verse 9, a great open door for effective work. Do everything in love. Be strong enough to love. And there's a focus here that we love and support a particular kind of work. And I just want to slow down at that point, make sure that no one misunderstands what I'm saying. So we've been talking a lot about work, and we're just going to show you a few words about work. So verse 58 of chapter 15, our memory verse, that was a big theme, wasn't it, in chapter 15? All for Jesus means that the work and the pain and the labor and the hardship of being a Christian is worth it because of better bodies in the future. And we've been very broad and very general with that. The wonderful news is that almost anything that a Christian does can be described in that way. It's one of the great anti-pride truths in the Bible that the lowest slave in their world, many people in their churches were slaves, the lowest slave doing work that someone else has chosen for them, from which she or he derives no joy, that is still the work of the Lord. Again, for your notes, if you want, Colossians 3, verse 23, says to a slave, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. So that's work in general. But in chapter 16, the root word work, it comes 3 times. Let's have those up on the screen. And it seems much more specific here. So in verse 9, it is what Paul has been doing in Ephesus. So it's evangelism and it's discipling. It's what Timothy will do when he gets to Corinth, verse 10. So it is preaching and teaching, the kind of things that are in this letter. And then it's what the household of Stephanas do in verse 16, which is also called the service of the Lord's people in verse 15. Now, I don't think Paul means to make this too specific, and certainly not to make it too professional, but all of those kinds of work there in chapter 16, they are done with the message of Jesus. It's that kind of work that you do with the message of Jesus. But it's hard to find the right vocabulary. So if I say Christian work, for it, you'll think that I mean that Benny is, when he's installing solar panels, is somehow not working for Jesus. That's not Jesus' work. Or if I say church work, you'll think I mean that you need to be on a church staff team, on a payroll to be valuable. You don't. I do think that all work is Christian work in general, but a general meaning across the rest of the New Testament doesn't rule out a specific meaning here. And here, I think this work, it ranges across apostles and missionaries and evangelists and preachers and also home group leaders and All Souls kids teachers. I think those things, that's much more like what Stephanus and his household would be doing. But it does all mean work that you do with the message of Jesus. And that fits with the rest of 1 Corinthians. So we just throw up a few verses from elsewhere in 1 Corinthians. Some of the other references to work and the work of the Lord. Do you see in chapter 9, it is really personal. The church in Corinth, you are the result of my work in the Lord, Paul says. He was here in Corinth at the very beginning. He spoke in the synagogue till they threw him out, and some of you lot came with him to the room next door and he kept preaching. Or chapter 3 to read later, is really helpful for thinking about this kind of work properly. Says that anybody involved in this kind of work, whether it's Paul the apostle or Apollos the dazzling preacher or a heroic missionary or a local church pastor or your own fellowship group leader, says they are the co-workers of God. And then there's some illustrations in chapter 3. And the illustrations, they are both a privilege and a humiliation. So it is amazing to be God's co-worker, isn't it? That your fellowship group leader, when they bring you a Bible study on Tuesday, they are colleagues of God in building the church. Wow. But also, 3 verse 9, we should think of them, all of those same lists, the apostles and the missionaries and everybody, we should think of them the same way that we think of farmers and builders. In other words, it is all about the graft. It's all about the sweat, the quality of the sweat, not the status of the person. Church workers are not special people. God does not listen more to the prayers of church ministers than to any other Christian. Preachers are not more important than any of the other gifts in chapters 12 to 14. He's saying these are just the people who do the digging and the bricklaying. But then come back to our main heading. He is saying, though, that there is value in that work. Because work with the message of Jesus is the work that brings people to faith in Christ, which is the work that brings eternal life and the defeat of death, which is what he's been cheering about in chapter 15. Again, none of this really works without chapter 15. Why would I, Corinthian, give my money to pay for a mission partner to do this kind of work for the next 2 years? Why would I give up my Friday night to lead Bible studies for teenagers? Why would I use my lunch break to prepare a Bible study for the members of my life group? If this life is all there is, this life is the only chance my body gets, well, then it would be very difficult to give up any of being young, free, and single in London. But if I have a second, better body, then I can give myself fully to the work of the Lord. And during this series, we've thought about the way that death builds a kind of prison around our lives, a kind of slavery that we call YOLO. You only live once. In other words, this kind of pressure that you have to make the most of it. You have to make your life mean something. You have to experience everything. And that is not great, is it? It's not great for the person who wishes that they had a job that they enjoyed, or wonders, maybe I've missed out on the life that I should have had. Or maybe the person who is long-term sick and just one by one is missing all of the experiences that everyone else is having, or the person who hasn't been able to afford the house, or hasn't been able to find somebody to marry. But we said last week that in the end, death makes all of our achievements meaningless. You could tick off every single one on everybody's bucket list, and in the end you would still die the same as everybody else, too soon, with too little done. Actually, really, nobody is striding through life on a wave of fulfillment and success. They're either pretending or they haven't noticed yet how small everything they're getting done is. But compared to them, Stephanus, verse 15, and his household, probably we're talking here about a small church of 20 gathered in his front room. Probably all they do, they close the business for the morning. Maybe Stephanus is a smith or something. He's making stuff. They close the business. They gather in the front room to meet. And when they do, his kids, they are looking after the younger children. Probably somebody makes some food. There's nothing going on that Corinth would recognize as wise or strong or influential or noble. But Paul says they have devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. They have carried on the work of the Lord locally. And with a new body, that is worth it. That is the defeat of death. That is the reward of the Lord in chapter 3. That is that they have been strong enough to love, strong enough to do that instead of all the competitive nonsense of Corinth. Okay, we're nearly out of time. I'm going to give 2 more examples much more quickly. So third, the value of God's workers. And this is really, it's the same verses and it's similar. I just wanted us to notice how much here is about the people doing the work, not just the work itself. So some people are named, and there's quite a lot about how you should treat them. You've got Paul, then you've got Timothy, where Paul has to say, please don't terrify him. Please don't despise him. Then you have Apollos following down the verses. Remember Apollos? He was the person who they said was a lot better than Paul. Apollos, he came to Corinth a few months after Paul left, and they have repeatedly let Paul know what they think. Apollos, he is a much, much better preacher. Much better in every way. Better preacher, better wisdom. He's much more attractive to Corinth. We want him. We follow Apollos, said a big chunk of the church. And the whole thing was set to split apart over that, chapter 1, because Apollos was better at some things than Paul. And here at the end of the letter, Paul says, I love Apollos. He's our brother, who I strongly urge to go to you. You don't do that if you're in competition, do you? Somebody's better than you. That's the one you lock in the changing rooms. They can't get on the pitch. But Paul says, I love Apollos. I want him to go to you. And they are insecure, which makes them competitive and divided. And Paul, he just refuses to play. It's easy to say, isn't it? And it's much harder for us to do. With Timothy, with Stephanus in particular, there is a challenge to the sort of normal Christian in Corinth. And the challenge is, do you value those people enough to make their work easy? So they're not going to enjoy hearing 1 Corinthians when Timothy brings it. We know from 2 Corinthians they really didn't. They didn't like it. But he says he's trying to do the Lord's work, and he'll do it better if he's not afraid of you. Peace will be better, verse 11. Or look at verse 15, verse 16. You can imagine maybe the kind of time that Stephanus has had with his home group, with his little church in the house, with all the stuff that's in Corinth. So dealing with the sexual immorality and the drunkenness in church and the competitive spiritual gifts and the divisions. He's just trying to help you and serve the Lord. So I urge you, verse 16, to submit to such people. Submit being here just a part of love, strong enough to love. Stop with insisting on your own glory and help him instead. And submit there, that does not mean the private jet of the prosperity preacher. It does not mean the authoritarianism of the sort of pastor as dictator. The model in this letter is Paul, who is unpaid, weak and trembling, unimpressive, and actually Paul, who models himself on Jesus, the one who was crucified in our place. Okay, fourth and finally, the value of each other in the last few verses, but it does go right through this chapter. love the poorer Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Why? Because they're valuable. They're the Lord's. Paul's travel plans. Why is he so much detail? It's because he loves them and he knows that they could be hurt if they thought he was delaying it. Timothy, he can see how hard it's going to be, so he's trying to prepare the ground. Apollos, his rival, who he loves. Verse 17, there's 3 people who traveled to him from Corinth, and just how happy he was to see them. And then there's a list of greetings. He's saying there are churches all over Asia, and they care about you. And actually, if you would stop competing with them just for 5 minutes, then you might be able to hear the way that they feel about you and the way they love you and they pray for you. It's there in the very not English kiss in verse 20. Again, didn't see many people kiss each other as they arrived tonight. That is the basic attitude of the Christian brother and sister to every other Christian, the cultural equivalent, wherever you are, of the Middle Eastern kiss of welcome. And then under all of it is the love for Jesus, verse 22, which is not negotiable. You are not a strong Christian if you do not love. You are not the best church in the world if you do not love. Verse 22, you might not be a church at all if that's not who you are. And then through the whole letter, verse 24, in Christ Jesus, Paul loves them. Again, if you remember any of the previous series, isn't that a stunning thing to say? This church, with all of their problems, with all the ways that they are just as mixed up as London and London churches in the 21st century, he loves them. He loves them. Jesus loves them. Jesus loves us. Be on your guard. Stand firm. Have courage. Have the strength to love.